The snow was falling in thick, heavy sheets on the eastern front. Snow so dense that it blurred the outlines of men, rifles, and even the wreckage of machines half buried beneath winter's weight. It was the final months of the war, when every hour felt like a hostage situation between life and death. In the white silence, footsteps crunched, a Soviet patrol advancing cautiously through what had once been a German staff camp. They expected resistance. They expected hidden weapons. They expected desperation. What they did not expect was a single German officer, standing upright in front of the ruins of his command post, uniform immaculate, boots polished, medals still pinned to his chest, as if the war had not already torn half the continent apart around him. He did not raise his hands. He did not kneel. He did not even blink. He simply said, in a firm and steady voice, "I demand to be treated with respect. I am an officer of the Wehrmacht." The Soviet soldiers stared at him. He was outnumbered, exhausted, and defeated. His division had collapsed hours earlier. Yet he spoke as if he still commanded battalions. For a moment, the Russian sergeant who led the patrol did not know whether to laugh, shoot him, or arrest him. The officer's tone was not arrogant, only rigid, like a man trying to hold on to the last thread of dignity he had left in a world that had been burning for 6 years. And what happened next surprised everyone on both sides. The Russian soldiers' response, unexpected, human, and completely outside the logic of war, would turn a moment of surrender into a story that outlived the men who witnessed it. The winter of 1945 did not arrive gently on the Eastern Front. It descended like a punishment, burying the remnants of armies already exhausted by years of brutality. Villages had become empty shells, forests were cratered like the moon, and roads were nothing more than frozen scars carved by retreating columns. For the Germans, the Eastern Front had once been a place of ambition. In 1941, when Operation Barbarossa began, the Wehrmacht marched confidently across fields that seemed endless and unbroken. Town after town fell. Columns of prisoners stretched beyond the horizon. Berlin believed that victory was inevitable. But the Eastern Front did not bend. It endured. And when the tide turned, it carried with it the wrath of millions who had lost everything. By early 1945, the Red Army was pushing west with relentless force. Entire Soviet armies moved like vast steel tides, reclaiming land inch by inch, village by village. Behind them lay the memory of scorched earth and shattered families. Ahead of them waited German defenses that were collapsing under the crushing weight of reality. Among those defenses was the officer whose world was about to disappear. His name was Helmut Kramer, a career Wehrmacht officer from a family that believed deeply in military tradition. He had been raised on stories of discipline, duty, and honor. Stories where an officer never bowed his head, even in defeat. To him, a uniform was more than fabric. It was a shield, a final boundary against chaos. But even officers bleed. Even officers fear. And in 1945, even officers understood that the war was ending, and not in the way they had been promised. Across the battlefield, the Soviet sergeant who would soon confront him, Sergei Antonov, carried a different history. He had been a factory worker from Leningrad before the war. In 1941, he survived the early bombardments. In 1942, he survived hunger during the siege. In 1943, he marched with the Red Army after losing 2 brothers in the fighting. The war had shaped him into a soldier, but not a cruel one. If anything, suffering had carved unexpected depth into his sense of justice. The 2 men, one German, one Russian, were supposed to be enemies without nuance. Everything in their worlds told them they should view each other as symbols, not humans. One represented invasion, the other retribution. One wore the sharp lines of a collapsing empire, the other the coarse, frost-covered layers of a rising one. Yet fate placed them in the same ruined camp, in the final days of a war that had consumed both their nations. A war where respect was rare, dignity was fragile, and mercy was sometimes the only thing that kept a person human. And it was here, in this freezing ruin, that a German officer's demand and a Russian soldier's response would clash in a way neither side expected. The firefight that had torn through the camp earlier in the morning had faded, leaving only the lingering sharp smell of gunpowder. Broken crates, scattered documents, and pieces of shattered equipment littered the ground. Smoke still curled from a half-destroyed radio truck. The German command staff had either fled or fallen. Only one man had remained behind, Helmut Kramer. Sergeant Sergei Antonov advanced through the debris with his small patrol. The men were cold, tense, and wary of surprises. Germans had been known to feign surrender, hiding a final grenade or pistol. The Red Army had been trained to expect treachery. They had experienced it more than once. But Kramer did not behave like a man plotting an attack. He stood tall, back straight, arms relaxed at his sides. His breath fogged in the freezing air, and yet he did not shiver. He looked almost like a statue carved from ice and pride. "Raise your hands," Antonov ordered. Kramer did not move. "I will not," he replied calmly. "I am an officer. You will treat me accordingly." The Soviet soldiers exchanged glances. One of them muttered something bitter under his breath. Another lifted his rifle slightly, as if expecting Antonov to give the order to fire. Antonov felt irritation rising in him. He had seen arrogance before. German officers often carried themselves with a sense of superiority, as if the rules of suffering did not apply to them. But something in Kramer's posture was different. It was not arrogance born of ideology. It was something older, something drilled into him long before the swastika became the emblem of German power. Still, Antonov could not allow defiance. "Not here. Not now." "You are surrounded," Antonov said, stepping closer. "Your army is gone. The war is lost for you. Raise your hands." Kramer's jaw tightened, but his eyes did not waver. "My army may be defeated," he said, "but I am still a soldier. I have the right to surrender with dignity." Dignity. The word struck Antonov like a blow. Dignity had been stripped away from millions during the war, civilians and soldiers alike. Antonov had seen people die without names, without graves, without a last word spoken over them. He had watched comrades fall in trenches and forests. He had stood by the mass graves outside Leningrad. And now, here was a German officer, representative of the army that had brought such destruction, speaking of dignity. One of Antonov's men grew impatient. "Sergeant, let me disarm him," he said. "A quick strike and—" "No," Antonov interrupted. The patrol fell silent. Kramer expected a threat, a kick, a rifle butt to the face. Something violent and humiliating. Many officers captured during the late months of the war had faced far worse. Instead, Antonov studied him carefully. "Why did you stay?" he asked finally. "You could have run with the others." Kramer hesitated. The question seemed to disarm him more effectively than any weapon. "I gave my word," he said, "to remain with the wounded until the end. Most did not survive the morning attack." Antonov looked at the ruins, the bodies half covered by snow. The war had left little room for mercy, but not all hearts were empty. Not all actions were born of cruelty. And this man, this enemy, had stayed for reasons that had nothing to do with politics or orders. He had stayed out of a sense of obligation, out of loyalty to men who could no longer speak for themselves. Antonov lowered his rifle slightly. "You demand respect," he said quietly. "Do you offer it in return?" For the first time, Kramer's rigid mask cracked. "Yes," he said. "Ida." Behind Antonov, his men watched in confusion. They expected dominance, not dialogue. They expected the usual ritual of surrender, stripping the officer of weapons, forcing him to his knees, marching him to the rear like a trophy of war. But Antonov was seeing something different, a moment where the war's relentless brutality paused, even if just for a breath. He stepped closer, his boots crunching on the frozen ground. "All right," Antonov said. "You will surrender with dignity if you follow my orders. No defiance. No resistance." Kramer nodded once, sharply, like a salute frozen in motion. The escalating tension between them, officer and sergeant, enemy and enemy, pride and exhaustion, hung in the air like a blade. And the moment that followed would determine whether this fragile understanding held, or whether the war's merciless rhythm would consume both men again. The wind intensified as clouds drifted overhead, darkening the ruined camp. It was as if the sky itself sensed the fragile moment forming between the two men, one demanding dignity, the other deciding whether to grant it in the final months of a brutal war. Sergeant Sergei Antonov stepped closer until he stood only a few feet from Helmut Kramer. His men tightened their grip on their rifles. They did not understand what Antonov was doing, and mistrust flickered in their eyes. They had seen German officers use false pride to mask hidden weapons, or to buy time for a counterattack. "Search him," one whispered. "Careful," another warned. He could have a pistol, but Antonov raised a hand, silencing them. He kept his gaze locked on Kramer, searching his expression for any hint of deceit. The German officer's face was pale, drawn, and exhausted, but his posture remained upright, almost ceremonial. He was a man clutching the last remaining fiber of identity he had left. Antonov spoke first. "Remove your sidearm." Kramer hesitated, not out of defiance, but out of ritual. For him, handing over a weapon was not simply surrendering steel. It was surrendering the authority he'd worn since his youth. His fingers brushed the grip of his pistol. A memory flickered in his eyes. Parades, training academies, crisp uniforms, a life defined by hierarchy. Slowly, deliberately, Kramer unbuckled the holster and extended the pistol toward Antonov with both hands, holding it level, almost like an offering. Antonov did not take it immediately. He waited, watching for the slightest tremor of resistance. But the pistol remained steady. Only then did he reach out and take it. The exchange was silent, but powerful. It was not victory or humiliation, it was mutual recognition. A strange acknowledgement that both men had survived too much to treat this moment carelessly. One of the Soviet soldiers muttered, "Are we doing this or arresting him?" Antonov turned briefly. "We are doing both," he said. "But properly." He faced Kramer again. "Now your gloves," he said. Kramer removed them without protest. Next came his belt knife. Then the compass. Each item he handed over with the same measured calm, as if performing an old ceremony in a world where ceremonies no longer meant anything. When he was finally unarmed, Antonov stepped back and studied him. "You understand," Antonov said quietly, "that many would not have shown you this." Kramer nodded. "Ida." "But you stood your ground. You spoke honestly. You stayed with your wounded." Antonov paused. "Respect is not given freely in war. But sometimes it is earned." A faint breath escaped the German officer. Something between relief and disbelief. And then the unexpected occurred. Instead of ordering Kramer to kneel, instead of binding his hands, instead of forcing him into the role of a defeated man, Antonov stepped aside and gestured for him to walk with the patrol. Side by side, the Soviet soldiers exchanged startled glances. They had expected a prisoner, not a guest. A spectacle of dominance, not a quiet escort. Kramer blinked, unsure. "You will not make me kneel?" "No," Antonov said. "You surrendered like a soldier. You will walk like one." The moment struck Kramer more deeply than Antonov could have imagined. His breath hitched, not from weakness, but from the shock of receiving something he had not expected at the end of a brutal war, humanity. Antonov's men reluctantly stepped aside, opening a small path through the snow. Kramer walked forward, chest still straight but eyes softened by something new. Respect had been demanded, but respect had also been returned. In a war defined by mercilessness, the climax of their confrontation was not violence but a gesture that defied the logic of 6 years of bloodshed. The patrol moved slowly through the ruined landscape, leaving behind the shattered German camp. Snow continued to fall, softening the harsh outlines of wreckage and bodies. Each step felt like part of a final march toward the end of a war that had consumed both nations, both armies, and both men walking side by side. Helmut Kramer did not speak at first. He walked with the Soviet patrol, unarmed, exhausted, and defeated, but not broken. The dignity he had fought so hard to maintain still traced his posture. And yet, behind his stoic expression, something had changed. A man who once believed respect came only from rank and tradition had just experienced a different kind of respect. one rooted not in symbols or commands, but in simple recognition of another man's humanity. Sergei Antonov remained quiet as well. He walked at the front, glancing back occasionally. He did not regret his decision. War had taken too much, twisted too many people, buried too many futures. If there was one place to reclaim a piece of himself, it was here, offering dignity where cruelty could have been easier. One of Antonov's soldiers finally approached him. "Sergeant, why him?" Antonov's voice was steady. "Because someone has to decide when the war inside us ends." The words settled like snow on the men around him. They did not fully understand them, not yet. But they felt the truth in them. Behind them, Kramer overheard. For the first time since the morning, a faint warmth stirred in his chest. Not gratitude alone, but a realization. This Russian sergeant had shown him more honor in defeat than many had shown him in victory. As they approached the Soviet lines, Kramer stopped walking and turned to Antonov. "I want to say something," he said quietly. "I have fought for many years. I have seen terrible things. I have ordered terrible things. But today, you saw me not as an enemy, but as a man. I will not forget that." Antonov nodded once. "War makes monsters of us. But we do not have to stay that way." Kramer lowered his eyes, the first true sign of humility he had shown all day. "No," he said. "We do not." He extended his hand, an unthinkable gesture hours earlier. Antonov hesitated only a moment before taking it. It was not forgiveness. It was not friendship. It was simply two soldiers acknowledging that the world was finally beginning to turn away from madness. A few minutes later, Kramer was processed like any other prisoner of war. But the men who escorted him would remember something different. Not his surrender, but the brief moment when humanity overcame history. And in the quiet after the patrol's footsteps faded, it felt as if the cold Eastern Front paused, just long enough to let the memories settle into the frozen earth. In the silence that followed, dignity became the last thing the war had not taken.